March 1943. The clock on the wall of the Heatwave Club didn't just tell time. It measured the pulse of a neighborhood that never truly slept, even when the rest of the world was at war. Outside, the blackout curtains were drawn tight against the possibility of Axis bombers, but inside, the air was a thick, swirling soup of expensive Turkish tobacco, expensive perfume, and the cheap, metallic scent of nervous sweat. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual booth, tucked into the far corner where the shadows were deepest and the sightlines were clearest. He was a man of stillness. While the world around him fractured and screamed, Bumpy remained a fixed point, an anchor in the shifting tides of Upper Manhattan. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His presence was a low-frequency hum that everyone in the room felt in their teeth. The war had changed the city, but it hadn't changed the fundamental truth of power. Men still wanted what they hadn't earned. And tonight, the air tasted different. It wasn't the usual scent of jazz and joy. It was the sharp, ozone tang that precedes a lightning strike. Two men had entered 10 minutes ago. They didn't look like the usual Harlem revelers. They wore overcoats that were a fraction too heavy for the early spring evening. Their hats snapped low over eyes that didn't linger on the dancers or the band. They were out of place like sharks in a freshwater pond. These were Albert Anastasia's men, extensions of the Mad Hatter's reach, sent from the humid, blood-soaked docks of Brooklyn to the refined elegance of 7th Avenue. They stood at the bar, not drinking, just watching. They were a message written in flesh and bone. The message was simple. The old borders were dissolving. The five families were looking north, past the invisible line of 110th Street, seeing not a community, but a harvest. They saw the nightclubs, the policy banks, and the bars as fruit ripe for the picking. Bumpy watched them through the amber haze of his glass. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't signal his own men, who were positioned like gargoyles in the rafters and doorways. He simply observed the mechanics of their disrespect. They leaned against the mahogany bar with a proprietary ease, as if they already owned the wood beneath their elbows. To them, Harlem was a colony, and Bumpy Johnson was merely a local chieftain who had grown too comfortable in his palace. The music, a frantic, upbeat swing number, seemed to lose its luster. The trumpet player hit a flat note. The dancers began to drift toward the edges of the floor. The rhythm of the room was breaking. This was the opening move in a game of psychological chess. By simply standing there, silent and menacing, Anastasia's hitters were attempting to drain the color from the room, to replace the heat wave's warmth with the cold, gray reality of Murder Incorporated. Bumpy felt the weight of the neighborhood on his shoulders. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the sanctity of the borders. If he allowed these men to stand here unchallenged, if he let them breathe the air of his kingdom without paying the tax of respect, the wall would crumble. Tomorrow it would be a protection fee. The day after it would be a takeover. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. The ice clinked against the glass. A small, sharp sound that seemed to echo in the sudden lull of the music. He saw the two men whisper to each other, their eyes darting toward his booth. They were waiting for him to blink. They expected him to send a lieutenant over to negotiate, to offer a tribute to keep the peace. That was how the Italians played the game. Pressure followed by a payoff followed by permanent occupation. But Bumpy Johnson didn't negotiate with shadows. He knew that power wasn't something you shared. It was something you held with a grip so tight that it bled. The Italians thought they were the only ones who understood the language of violence, but Bumpy spoke it with a much more refined accent. He watched as the taller of the two men finally detached himself from the bar. He walked toward Bumpy's booth with a slow, swaggering gait, his hand hovering near the vent of his overcoat. Every eye in the club followed him. The silence was now absolute. Even the clinking of silverware had stopped. The man stopped 3 feet from Bumpy's table, leaning forward just enough to invade the personal space that Bumpy had cultivated over a decade of dominance. The man didn't speak immediately. He let the silence hang, trying to use it as a weapon. Bumpy didn't look up. He continued to study the patterns of the wood grain on his table, his face a mask of granite-carved indifference. He was teaching the man a lesson in the hierarchy of the room. In this space, Bumpy Johnson was the gravity. Everyone else was just dust caught in his orbit. When Bumpy finally raised his eyes, they were cold, dark pools that reflected nothing. He didn't look at the man's face. He looked through it, as if he were staring at a distant, unimportant point on the horizon. The Italian's confidence flickered for a heartbeat, a micro-expression of doubt that Bumpy catalogued and filed away for later use. "You're a long way from the docks," Bumpy said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried to the furthest corners of the room despite its lack of volume. The man smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The boss says the air is better up here. Thinks it's time we started taking regular walks on 7th Avenue. It was an open declaration of war disguised as a pleasantry. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the pistol tucked into his waistband. He simply leaned back, the leather of the booth creaking softly under his weight. He looked around the room, at the frightened faces of the waitresses and the defiant glint in the eyes of his own soldiers. He wasn't just Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem. He was the wall. He was the only thing standing between these people and the meat grinder of the Brooklyn mob. If he faltered now, if he showed even a tremor of hesitation, the 1943 shakedown would become the 1943 massacre. "Harlem has a way of being hard on tourists," Bumpy replied. "The sidewalks are unforgiving. Men get lost. They disappear into the cracks and the basement flats, and they aren't heard from again until the snow melts." The threat was implicit, delivered with the calm authority of a man describing the weather. He wasn't boasting, he was stating a topographical fact. The Italian's hand twitched near his coat. He was used to people pleading or shouting or reaching for their own steel. He wasn't used to this level of icy surgical control. Bumpy noticed the twitch. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "Go back to Albert. Tell him that the clubs in Harlem don't pay for the privilege of existing. We earned that right ourselves. Tell him that if he wants to collect something from me, he should come himself. But remind him, I don't give change." The man opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in his throat. From the shadows behind the bar, 3 of Bumpy's men stepped into the light. They didn't draw weapons. They simply stood there, large and immovable, their shadows stretching across the floor until they touched the Italian's shoes. The numbers had shifted. The geography of the room had reasserted itself. The 2 Italians realized, with a sudden and jarring clarity, that they were surrounded not just by men, but by a community that loathed them. They were an infection, and the body of Harlem was beginning to sweat them out. Without another word, the man turned and gestured to his partner. They walked toward the exit, their swagger replaced by a stiff, hurried pace. They didn't look back. They pushed through the blackout curtains and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy with fear, but electric with the anticipation of what was to come. Bumpy remained in his booth. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He knew this was only the first ripples of a coming storm. Albert Anastasia wasn't a man who took no for an answer, and Murder Incorporated didn't leave debts uncollected. But as the band tentatively started up a new number, slower this time, more soulful, Bumpy felt a grim satisfaction. The lines had been drawn. The 1943 shakedown had begun, and Bumpy Johnson had just made it clear that in Harlem, the only currency that mattered was respect, and he owned the mint. He watched the door for a long time after they left, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the curtain. The shadow of the Italian mob was long, but tonight, it hadn't been long enough to reach his table. He gestured to the waiter for another drink. The heat wave was his. 7th Avenue was his. And before the sun rose over the East River, every policy runner, every bartender, and every street corner hustler would know that the king had stood his ground. The war was coming, but Bumpy Johnson was ready. He had been born in the fire. A little more heat from Brooklyn wasn't going to make him burn. The morning after the encounter at the heatwave, Harlem felt like a city under siege, though not by the Luftwaffe. The threat was more intimate, a creeping frost moving up from the docks of Brooklyn. By 10 a.m., the news had traveled through the kitchen doors of every restaurant and the back rooms of every barbershop. The Italians were coming for the till. Bumpy Johnson walked down 7th Avenue with his coat unbuttoned despite the biting March wind. He didn't walk like a man hiding from a storm. He walked like the man who owned the sky. Every few steps he was stopped. A shopkeeper would step out from behind a display of winter apples. A numbers runner would pause his route. They didn't ask questions, not directly. They looked at Bumpy with eyes that searched for a crack in the granite. They were looking to see if their world was about to change. Anastasia's reputation preceded him like a foul odor. The Mad Hatter was not a man of finesse. He was the high priest of the electric chair, the CEO of Murder Incorporated. His method was simple: total submission or total erasure. In the Bronx and Brooklyn, he had already turned the nightlife into a conveyor belt of tribute. Now he wanted the crown jewel. He wanted the Harlem clubs, the Savoy, the Cotton Club, the small, smoky basements where the real money changed hands. Bumpy spent the afternoon in the back of 22 West, a small restaurant that served as his unofficial parliament. One by one, the club owners arrived. These were men who had built empires out of nothing, men who had survived the Depression and the police, but the name Anastasia made their hands shake as they lit their cigarettes. "They came to my place this morning," whispered Solomon, a man who ran a jazz spot on 133rd. Two of them. They didn't say much. They just sat in the front row and stared at the stage while the cleaners were working. Before they left, they told me the new tax starts Friday. 20% of the door, or the building might develop a problem with the foundation. Bumpy listened, his face as still as a frozen lake. He didn't interrupt. He let them vent their terror. He knew that fear was like a gas. If you didn't let it out, it would explode. He watched the way they looked at him, waiting for the word. To these men, Bumpy wasn't just a boss. He was the personification of Harlem's autonomy. If he bent, they would all break. Albert thinks in numbers. Bumpy finally spoke, his voice cutting through the frantic chatter like a razor through silk. He sees a map of the city and he sees a vacuum. He thinks because our skin is dark, our resolve is thin. He thinks he can bring his Brooklyn dockworker tactics to our streets and will scramble for the crumbs. He leaned forward, the light from the overhead bulb catching the sharp crease of his trousers. But Albert doesn't understand the chemistry of this neighborhood. In Brooklyn, they follow him because they're afraid to die. In Harlem, you follow me because we've already died 1,000 times to get what we have. We aren't paying a cent. Not for protection, not for permission, and certainly not to satisfy the greed of a man who doesn't know the difference between a jazz club and a warehouse. The room went silent. The weight of the declaration hung heavy in the air. Bumpy wasn't just refusing to pay. He was declaring an embargo on the most dangerous man in New York. As the owners filed out, Bumpy stayed behind with his inner circle. He knew that rhetoric wouldn't stop a Tommy gun. He began to organize the community watch. This wasn't a military mobilization in the traditional sense. It was an invisible net. He placed eyes on every corner leading into the district. If a car with Brooklyn plates crossed 110th Street, Bumpy would know before it reached 116th. He understood that Anastasia's power relied on the myth of his own invincibility. Shakedowns only work if the victim believes there is no alternative but to pay. Bumpy's strategy was to provide that alternative, a wall of absolute silent resistance. He spent the rest of the day visiting the lower-level enforcers, the street-level soldiers who lived in the tenements. He didn't offer them extra money. He spoke to them about legacy. He reminded them that their children walked these streets, and if they let the mafia in now, their children would grow up as servants in their own homes. By evening, the art of the shakedown had met the art of the standstill. Anastasia's men tried to return to the heat wave, but this time, the doors were locked for private maintenance. They went to the Savoy, but the doormen, 6'4" giants in tuxedos, simply looked through them as if they were ghosts. No one would talk to them. No one would serve them. No one would acknowledge their threats. It was a psychological blockade. In the mind of a mobster like Anastasia, violence is the answer to resistance, but how do you fight a neighborhood that simply turns its back on you? Bumpy was orchestrating a masterpiece of social defiance. He was turning the very air of Harlem into something the Italians couldn't breathe. But Bumpy wasn't naive. He knew that when the Mad Hatter couldn't get what he wanted with a sneer, he would come with a flame. As he sat on the stoop of his apartment building late that night, watching the patrols move silently through the shadows, Bumpy felt the cold steel of the pistol against his hip. He wasn't just protecting the money. He was protecting the soul of the 1943 Harlem. The Italians thought they were the predators, but Bumpy Johnson was teaching them a lesson in ecology. In this jungle, the lion didn't care how many hyenas were at the gate. He just waited for them to make the first move. And as the moon disappeared behind the clouds, Bumpy knew that the real test was coming. Anastasia would not let this humiliation stand. The shakedown had failed, which meant the war was no longer about profit, it was about blood. Bumpy closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the distant sound of a saxophone. It was a lonely, beautiful sound, a reminder of what was at stake. He would not let that music be silenced by a man from Brooklyn. Not today. Not ever. The following afternoon, the air in Harlem felt brittle, like old parchment ready to ignite. Bumpy Johnson stood by the window of a second-story brownstone on 126th Street. From this vantage point, he could see the rhythm of the block, the way the children played closer to their doorsteps, the way the street vendors kept their eyes on the intersections instead of their wares. The neighborhood knew. The tension wasn't a secret. It was a physical weight. Bumpy turned back to the room. Seated around a heavy oak table were the kings of Harlem's underworld. The policy kings, the club owners, and the elders who held the community's secrets in their graying heads. These were men who had built empires with their bare hands, but today, they looked like men waiting for a death sentence. "Albert doesn't just want the clubs, Bumpy," one man said, his voice trembling as he crushed out a half-finished cigarette. "He wants the numbers. He wants the docks. He wants to turn every man in this room into a glorified janitor for the 5 families." Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He walked to the table and placed a single object in the center. A small, blackened piece of steel. A firing pin from a Tommy gun. It was a silent reminder of what lay at the end of the road they were walking. "Power," Bumpy began, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filling every corner of the room, "is not something that is given. It is a lease you sign with your own blood every single morning." The Italians think they can rewrite that lease. They think they can walk into Harlem and treat us like sharecroppers because they have murder incorporated behind them. He leaned over the table, his eyes locking onto each man in turn. But sovereignty isn't about who has the most guns. It's about who belongs to the soil. Albert Anastasia is a tourist. His men are tourists. They come here to take, but they don't know how to keep. If we give them 1 inch, 1 single cent of tribute, we aren't just losing money. We are losing the right to call ourselves men. This was the core of Bumpy's philosophy, the art of sovereignty. He understood that the Italian mob operated on the principle of the great devourer. They didn't want partners. They wanted subjects. He spoke to the assembly for over an hour, not about violence, but about the moral obligation of leadership. He reminded them of the 1935 riots, of the lean years when they were the only ones who fed the hungry in the tenements. "If we pay Anastasia," Bumpy said, his hand coming down hard on the table, "we are telling our people that we cannot protect them. We are telling the mothers on 135th Street that their sons are now subjects of a man in Brooklyn who wouldn't stop his car if he ran them over. Is that the legacy you want?" The room shifted. The fear was still there, but it was being forged into a cold, hard anger. Bumpy wasn't just asking for their loyalty. He was demanding their dignity. He laid out the steel protocol. No club owner was to meet with an Italian representative without Bumpy's presence. No money was to be moved. If an enforcer showed up, he was to be met with a wall of silence. "We make the air too thin for them to breathe," Bumpy commanded. "We don't shout. We don't argue. We just don't comply. Let them see that Harlem is a solid stone. You can't shake down a mountain." As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the floorboards, the men stood up one by one. There were no handshakes, only nods, the silent, heavy pact of men who knew they might be dead by morning. Bumpy watched them leave, his face unreadable. He knew he had just convinced them to gamble everything on his vision of a free Harlem. He remained in the room long after the others had gone. He sat in the dark, the only light coming from the glowing tip of his cigar. He was thinking about the price of steel. He was thinking about the way the Italian families operated, their hierarchies, their egos, and their fatal flaw. They couldn't imagine a world where someone didn't fear them. Bumpy wasn't afraid. He had been through the Atlanta pen. He had stared down the worst of the law and the worst of the streets. To him, Anastasia was just another man who thought his shadow was bigger than his soul. He stood up and checked the action on his .38. It moved with a smooth, oiled precision. The decision was made. The borders were sealed. The sovereignty of Harlem wasn't a topic for debate. It was a fact, and Bumpy Johnson was the one who would write it in the history books or die trying. He stepped out onto the balcony and looked toward the south. The lights of Midtown were flickering, but Harlem was dark, watchful, and ready. The pressure from the enemy was mounting, but the foundation was set in stone. The following Friday, the Starlight Lounge became the center of the universe. It was the largest room in Bumpy's orbit, a cathedral of velvet and brass where the elite of Harlem came to forget the war and the weight of the world. But tonight, the tables were empty. The band was gone. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator behind the bar and the distant, muffled siren of a police car blocks away. Bumpy Johnson sat alone at a circular table in the dead center of the dance floor. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit. His tie knotted with surgical precision. On the table before him sat a single glass of water and a deck of cards. He was playing solitaire, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. He was not waiting for a guest. He was waiting for an intruder. At exactly 11 p.m., the front doors of the Starlight were kicked open. The sound was like a gunshot in the hollow room. For men stepped in. They were the collection squad, Albert Anastasia's personal message deliverers. They were led by a man named Vinny the Hammer, a brute who had built a career on breaking the spirits of men who thought they were brave. They walked with the heavy, arrogant tread of conquerors entering a fallen city. Vinny stopped 10 feet from Bumpy's table. He looked around the empty room, a mocking sneer curling his lip. "Nice place you got here, Johnson. A bit quiet, though. Hard to pay the boss his taste when you don't have any customers." Bumpy didn't look up. He flipped a card. A red queen on a black king. "The club is closed for a private lesson," Bumpy said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I find that people learn better when there are no distractions." Vinny laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He signaled his men to fan out. They surrounded Bumpy, their hands tucked into their waistbands, their shadows stretching long across the polished floorboards. "The only lesson tonight is arithmetic. Albert is tired of the delays. We're here for the backtax on every club from 110th to the bridge. You've got a suitcase full of green, or we start taking it out in skin." Bumpy finally raised his eyes. He didn't look at the guns. He looked directly into Vinny's soul. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the silence of a predator watching a scavenger walk into a trap. "You've mistaken Harlem for a marketplace," Bumpy said softly. "You think everything here has a price tag that Albert can read. But you've overlooked the most important factor in the equation." "And what's that, Professor?" Vinny sneered, taking a step closer, his hand reaching for the blackjack in his pocket. "Permission," Bumpy replied. "You are standing on ground that does not recognize your authority. You are breathing air that belongs to my people. And you are speaking to a man who has decided that you are no longer welcome in his sight." Vinny's face flushed a deep, angry red. He wasn't used to being lectured. He was used to screaming and begging. He pulled the blackjack and slammed it onto the table, sent the cards flying like autumn leaves. "Enough of the poetry. Where's the money?" Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply looked at the scattered cards on the floor. "You've ruined the game, Vinny. That was a mistake." Suddenly, the lights in the rafters flickered and died. For 3 seconds, the room was plunged into total, abyssal darkness. In that darkness, The sound of half a dozen safety catches being clicked off echoed through the lounge like a synchronized heartbeat. When the lights snapped back on, the geography of the room had changed. In every balcony, behind every velvet curtain, and standing in the kitchen doorway were Bumpy's men. They weren't holding blackjacks. They were holding long-barreled shotguns and Thompson submachine guns. They were silent, motionless, and focused. The four Italians were now caught in a crossfire so tight that a single sneeze would turn the room into a slaughterhouse. Bumpy remained seated, his hands folded neatly on the table where the cards had once been. He looked at Vinny, whose face had gone from red to a sickly, translucent gray. The hammer was now a nail. "The money you came for doesn't exist," Bumpy said, his voice now a cold, terrifying rasp. "Every dime made in these clubs stays in these clubs. It pays for the food in the tenements. It pays for the lawyers who keep our boys out of your jails. It will never, under any circumstance, pay for Albert Anastasia's silk shirts." Vinny's hand hovered near his pocket, but he knew he was a dead man the moment he twitched. The sweat was pouring down his neck now, staining the collar of his expensive coat. Albert won't let this go, Johnson. You're starting a war you can't win." "The war started the moment you crossed 110th Street, Bumpy countered. "I am not starting it. I am finishing it. You will go back to Brooklyn. You will tell Albert exactly what you saw tonight. You will tell him that the collection failed because Harlem is not for sale. And you will tell him that if he sends another man to my doors, I won't send them back in a car. I'll send them back in a crate." Bumpy stood up. He was taller than he had seemed sitting down, a pillar of righteous, controlled fury. He walked toward Vinny, stopping only inches from his face. The Italian mobster, a man who had murdered dozens, found himself trembling. He could smell the tobacco on Bumpy's breath, and he could see the absolute terrifying lack of fear in Bumpy's eyes. "Get out," Bumpy whispered. The four men backed away, their eyes darting from the balconies to the floor. They didn't turn their backs until they reached the door. They scrambled out into the night, their tires screeching as they fled back toward the safety of the bridge. Bumpy stood in the center of the Starlight Lounge, surrounded by his soldiers. He didn't cheer. He didn't boast. He simply looked at the scattered cards on the floor and began to pick them up, one by one. The shakedown was over. The humiliation of Murder Incorporated was complete. He had stood in the center of the storm and forced the wind to change direction. As he placed the deck back in his pocket, Bumpy looked up at his men and gave a single sharp nod. The message had been sent. Now they would wait for the answer. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, the air in Harlem felt clean. The failed collection was a victory of the spirit, a declaration of independence written in the silence of the Starlight Lounge. The news of what happened at the Starlight Lounge didn't just travel. It detonated. By the next morning, the story was being whispered in the backrooms of the 5 family social clubs from East Harlem to the tip of Brooklyn. The Mad Hatter had sent his elite collectors into the heart of the city, and they had returned with nothing but trembling hands and a message of total defiance. Bumpy Johnson understood the potency of a story. He knew that for a man like Albert Anastasia, reputation was the only currency that mattered. If the world believed Anastasia could be ignored, his empire would begin to fray at the edges. Bumpy didn't just want to win the night. He wanted to dismantle the myth of the Italian untouchable. He spent the weekend visible. He took his breakfast at the Wells restaurant, sitting by the window in plain view of the street. He walked through the markets, shaking hands with the men who hauled the ice and the women who sold the greens. He was the living embodiment of the victory. Every smile he shared was a quiet jab at the Brooklyn mob. Every time he refused to look over his shoulder, he was telling the world that Albert Anastasia was a man who could be beaten. Meanwhile, the humiliation was working its way through the Italian hierarchy. Reports began to filter back to Bumpy through his network of informants. The heads of the other 4 families were laughing. They saw Anastasia's failure as a sign of weakness. They began to question his ability to manage the northern territories. By standing his ground, Bumpy hadn't just protected Harlem. He had turned the mafia against itself. Bumpy leaned into the psychological warfare. He sent a package to a neutral social club in Little Italy, addressed directly to Anastasia. It didn't contain a bomb or a threat. It contained a single, pristine deck of playing cards, the same ones Vinny the Hammer had scattered across the floor of the Starlight. It was a gesture of supreme arrogance, a way of saying, "You interrupted my game. Don't do it again." The tension was no longer about a shakedown. It was about the ego of a monster. Anastasia was a man of blood, and the common wisdom was that he would retaliate with a massacre. But Bumpy had calculated correctly. He knew that the other families, sensing the instability Bumpy had created, warned Anastasia to stay in his lane. They didn't want a full-scale race war in 1943. It was bad for business, and the police, under pressure from the war effort, would be forced to crack down on everyone. Bumpy had used the neighborhood as a shield and the Italian ego as a sword. He had managed to humiliate the most feared hitman in America without firing a single shot in public. He had proven that Harlem was a fortress, not because of its walls, but because of the man who stood at the gate. As the days turned into weeks, the Italian collectors disappeared from 7th Avenue. The new tax was forgotten. The clubs remained independent, their registers flowing into the community instead of the coffers of murder. Incorporated Bumpy had won a victory of restraint. He had shown that power wasn't just the ability to kill. It was the ability to make your enemy realize that killing you would cost more than they were willing to pay. The Mad Hatter had failed to collect. In the halls of power, that was a death sentence for a reputation. For Bumpy Johnson, it was the final seal on his crown. He had stood before the hurricane and told it to move. And the hurricane had moved. The dust of 1943 eventually settled, but the echoes of the Starlight Lounge lived on in the brick and mortar of Harlem. As the spring air softened and the threat of the Mad Hatter retreated back across the Brooklyn Bridge, the neighborhood didn't just return to normal. It evolved. The failed shakedown had been a trial by fire, and Harlem had emerged as a diamond, hard, brilliant, and impenetrable. Bumpy Johnson understood that a victory in the streets is temporary, but a victory in the mind is eternal. He had not just saved the nightclub owners a few $1,000s in tribute. He had preserved the concept of black ownership in a city that was constantly trying to erode it. He spent the closing months of the year ensuring that the Steele Protocol became a permanent fixture of his administration. He institutionalized the protection he had provided, creating a system where the community looked inward for its security rather than outward to a corrupt police force or a predatory mob. He became a ghost in the machine of the city's progress. He was the man you didn't see, but whose presence was felt every time a door stayed open or a business remained in the hands of its founders. The Italians had learned their lesson. Harlem was a sovereign state, and Bumpy Johnson was its undisputed architect. To move against him was not a business venture. It was a suicide mission. History would remember 1943 for the great battles in Europe and the Pacific, but in the heart of Manhattan, a different kind of war had been won. It was a war of nerves, a war of dignity, and a war of legacy. Bumpy had looked at the most powerful criminal organization in the world and told them no. And the world had not ended. Instead, it had expanded. As the year drew to a close, Bumpy sat on his familiar stoop, watching the winter snow begin to dust the statues of 7th Avenue. He was older, perhaps a bit more weary, but his eyes remained sharp, dark, and focused. He had outlasted the shakedown. He had humiliated the aggressors. And most importantly, he had kept his promise to the soil he walked upon. The legacy of the 1943 standoff became a blueprint for the decades to come. It was the moment when the king of Harlem became more than just a man with a gun. He became a symbol of resistance. He was the barrier. He was the wall. And as the lights of the heat wave flickered to life in the distance, casting a warm, defiant glow against the cold New York night, Bumpy Johnson took a slow pull of his cigar and watched the smoke rise, disappearing into a sky that belonged entirely to him.